Representative Daw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. HB230 has, for the most part, some very uncontroversial and straightforward provisions dealing with mail-in voting. The first provision clarifies when a municipality or county can declare that they're going to do their voting all vote by mail. That makes sure there's enough time for candidates and so forth to be prepared for what kind of election they're going to have to run. It goes through and puts in a process in place, which frankly most county clerks are following more or less right now, for rectifying what happens when the county clerk receives a mail-in ballot that looks like the signature may not match. This gives them a process to go through, and also gives the opportunity for the voter to correct the problem if in fact it was their ballot. It also, one of the concerns that we have is the only matching mechanism we have here is the signature. And so we want to do two things here. We want to make sure that the people voting understand that this is how their ballots can be verified that it's them. And we also are directing the Lieutenant Governor's office, and this is with their approval, to conduct an audit of signature matching to see that signatures are being properly matched in a vote-by-mail election. And then there's one teeny tiny, I think, uncontroversial provision here, which we may have some discussion about, which requires county clerks to pay the postage if they have an all vote-by-mail election. So obviously that's a policy goal which we may or may not have future discussion on, but that is the bill, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Peterson, you were first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I would move to amend.
That's in order. Go ahead.
Move Amendment 1 in my name. If we look at the fiscal note
Hold on just 1 second.
Amendment 2, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Amendment 2.
That's probably going to work better.
That's a better amendment.
Go ahead, Representative.
If we look at the fiscal note on this bill, there's a notation in there about what it will cost our counties to implement the business return postage for the mail-out ballots. And in there, it comes to a cost to our counties of about $450,000. As a policy, we try not to make people do things that will cost them money without us providing the funds for them to do that. And I'm afraid that this may, in essence, be an unfunded mandate on our county governments. I know in Weber County that it'll cost my county about $50,000, or about 10% of the entire election, to pay for this provision. I know that the county clerks have expressed some deep concerns about this expense. When looking at the cost-reward ratio, when we do pay for that postage, and in instances where that's been done in the past, the voter turnout has not been markedly higher than it would be otherwise. And so the value to getting voters to participate in the system is not, it's not justified by the expense of paying for that postage. And so what this amendment does is it basically strikes that requirement that the counties pay for this and just gives them the option to do so if they feel that it's in their best interest to do it. And that's the amendment, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem.
Representatives, the motion before us is to adopt Amendment number 2 in Representative Peterson's name. Discussion to the motion to amend.
Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I apologize. Representative Daw, to the sponsor of the bill. Sorry, sir, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Representatives, I resist this amendment, and I'm concerned about it. First of all, that fiscal note's going to be paid regardless. It's either going to be paid by the county directly, or it's going to be paid by the county through imposing a hidden tax upon all voters. That cost doesn't go away, and we can't hide it. And what concerns me about this more than anything else is the fact that if we leave this to the discretion of the county clerk, who knows what's going to happen? Some election cycles, they may decide, you know what, we're going to let the voter pay the cost. Some election cycles, we may decide to pay it ourselves, leaving the voter confused and possibly thinking that it's going to be paid and drop the envelope in the mail without it being paid and the vote potentially not counted. There's a lot of concerns I have with this. The fact is the data that's being presented to say that it doesn't materially affect outcome is pretty sketchy and just from 2 different counties. I'm not sure that that's accurate, but I will say this. The fact is, if we want to call it an unfunded mandate, then it's going to be an unfunded mandate any way you look at it. Either the counties who are charged with running an election and who are charged with financing that election right now, whether they pass this particular cost on to voters or not, that's not an unfunded mandate. That's their job, and that's what they have taxing authority for. On the other hand, if we allow county clerks to pass this cost on to voters, then clearly that's an unfunded mandate on them. So I prefer that we have consistency. I prefer that if a county wants to vote by mail, that's a perfectly fine decision, but let's let them bear the cost of what it really takes to run an election. And so I stand in opposition to this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, and I apologize for that. Representatives, we have a motion before us to adopt amendment number 2, discussion to the motion to amend. I've got lots of lights. If you want to discuss the motion to amend, please leave your light on, and I'll start in the order that they came in. Representative Arendt, you were first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I also stand in opposition to this amendment. How many of you know a college student with a stamp? Very few of them have them. And it's just one more step it's going to take for them to vote, and it's going to discourage them, and I don't think it's a good idea. I think that the good sponsor of this bill is right. Somebody's going to have to pay for this. Elections cost. I've heard county clerks complain about adding things to the ballot because it might mean that the ballot will go to a second page when they mail it. They're concerned about costs. I get it. But if we are going to have situations where everyone gets a vote by mail ballot, then we're going to have costs associated with that. We're also going to have savings. We need to look at that from the other side. I've heard from many county clerks that there's significant savings because they are not having to put poll workers in so many locations. But there are benefits and there are costs for every method we choose. And if we're going to require people to mail in their ballots, we should provide those free of charge. And think about this. In some counties, it might be easier to drop them off in a drop box. But in some counties, to get to a drop box, you may be driving 3 hours. So I really urge you to not adopt this amendment. It really does not make sense in terms of making it easier for people to vote.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Seno, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise in support of this amendment. There's always been a cost involved in voting. There's always been a responsibility on the person that needs to vote to make sure they get it right, whether it's driving to the poll, the gas that they put in their car, the time that they use. And just because we have a vote by mail ballot, we should not have to allow or make the county bear the cost of someone's mistake in returning that ballot. So without this amendment, I simply cannot support this piece of legislation. With it, I think it's a good piece of legislation.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Potter, you were next.
Yes, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I stand in support of this amendment. Use the example of previously our county used or didn't have vote by mail. It's like using the example of paying everybody's mileage to go to the voting booth. To think that they have to pay the postage for every voter is ridiculous, I think. I spent 6 years in the as elected county official, and if you've ever had to manage county budgets, it's about like managing the state budget. It's tough. You pinch every penny. It's a difficult procedure. My county clerk has contacted me about this, very much against this bill. It's a pretty good bill, actually, with the exception of the statement that the counties need to pick up the postage. I think that's the wrong thing to do, and I think it's a mandate, an unfunded mandate on the counties, and I think that's wrong. wrong thing for the state to do. Also, I talked to the Association of Counties who were also in favor of the legislation with the exception of the business about having the counties pick up the postage. So I support the amendment.
Thank you, sir. Representative Fossen, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I think I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made, and I view a tax as something that I am obligated to pay. I consider myself pretty frugal, so I drive mine to the ballot box and drop it off, and I don't pay anything in postage. And if I'm too young to figure out how to put a stamp on my ballot, I might not be in a good position to vote. So I really think that we need to learn how to put a stamp on, that we need to pay for it ourselves, or we just need to go drive it down to the box and drop it off. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Duckworth, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise in opposition to this motion, and I believe that I actually had a bill this year not ready for prime time. Just be patient, it will come. But I believe that it will save us money if we can continue to use the mail-in ballot as opposed to staffing ballot locations. And to me, it almost is a wash. So I would urge you to oppose the motion to amend.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Okay. Representative Winder, discussion to the motion to amend.
Thank you. I also rise in opposition to this amendment. There's been some around the country that have said a postage stamp is likened to a poll tax, which the 24th Amendment banned. Obviously, the 24th Amendment doesn't talk about saying any barrier to election should be done away with, but I do think if we're in a situation where we're doing vote by mail, to make it, one of the reasons we do vote by mail is to make it as easy as possible for the vast amount of people, the most amount of people, to participate in our democracy. And so I think by having the postage requirement covered on the government side as we facilitate the election is more conducive to more participants. And even if it's seen as a 41-cent poll tax, it's still a minor barrier that'd be great to equalize and not have. So I urge opposition to the amendment.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Representative Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I'm just wondering in this discussion if we thought about without a mail-in ballot, and when people drive to the ballot box to vote, do we pay for their gas? We don't. So I can't imagine why we would need the county to pay for the postage for this. So I support the amendment.
Thank you, Representative. Okay, seeing no further lights, Representative Daw, back to you, and then Representative Peterson, I'll come back to you.
Gee, I usually get to some on somebody else's amendment.
Does he have to?
All right, then, I'm going to skip you. Apologize. Fog of war, Representative, fog of war. Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. So the bottom line is that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's no such thing as a free stamp. Voters will pay for the stamp themselves at a postage rate that they get at their post office, or they will pay the business reply postage at the county rate, which ironically happens to be more expensive than the regular stamps you buy at the post office. So the cost of the voter will be more with business reply mail than it will be with a regular stamp. So the hidden costs are less than the actual cost of us doing business reply mail. Also, the voter turnout, speaking of the data that we have from that, that's from a national study of places that have done business reply mail for these kinds of mail-in ballots, and the voter turnout is not markedly higher according to those studies. So with that, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, by some.
Okay. Representatives, the motion before us is to adopt Amendment Number 2 in Representative Peterson's name. All in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. I'll rule that motion passes. Okay. Representatives, back to discussion on the bill as amended. Seeing none, Representative Daw, now I will come back to you for summation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I will point out a number of discussions during the course of the amendment was they like the bill without it, so now it's without it. Hopefully that will sway your vote my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representatives, voting is open on House Bill 230 as amended. Seeing all present having voted, voting is closed. House Bill 230, having received 70 yea votes, 1 nay vote, passes this body and will be referred to the Senate for further consideration.